Joe, good to have you on.
Hey Kyle, how's it going?
Doing well, doing well. I was really excited about this discussion and, with all of your technical expertise and, your background. And then I realized that you use Firefox as a browser and like that kind of made me feel more hesitant about you talking about technology trends. So
Firefox
we'll
on
just start
Windows.
there. No, why Firefox? Like, I got to know.
So for a while I was using Arc. So
Me,
I,
I love
I'm
Arc.
fully I like Arc too, but they're gonna not support their standard browser anymore, right? There's like a announcement about it. So now I'm like, all right, well, just in case I need to start experimenting. So I still have Arc installed. I use it primarily, although I'm starting to rotate off. Arc has weird problems. So I work in the internet space, right? We work on websites, and Arc breaks on so many different websites in weird ways, which I find kind of fun. But also, when I'm testing, I have Chrome, I have Chrome on my phone, and then Firefox on my laptop. It's partly like workish related, I guess, but partly also just me being hipster about it.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that makes sense. I mean, Arc it's got to be one of the fastest browsers. It's built on Chromium. And so that's the reason I use it. And it's just the ability to have like saved bookmarks, they're called like sections or whatever, but the way that you can structure those bookmarks is very unique.
It is actually like the whole reason I loved Arc is because you can do that. There's like tiers to it. You'd have those little buttons at the top. So my email is in a little button versus saved links, which are structured a little differently. Firefox enables some of that, but it's not that. What I liked most about Arc is that it actually played with interface in a way that most browsers that I'd experimented with over the years just didn't. Like there's the degree of difference between Firefox, Chrome, and Edge is pretty tight. So Opera, throw that in there too, right? So I just think that I really like that they tried to innovate.
Cool. Nice. All right, enough about browsers. That's pretty basic, but just talking about like CX and where you think the technology within CX is going. Like you have a unique perspective because you came from like networking, which is literally the foundation of the web and digital generally. So I'm kind of curious, like how has that perspective informed how you think about technology trends and ultimately where it ends up?
Yeah. So I mean, I think computer engineers and electrical engineers will tell you that the base machine is the foundation of all of that, right? So I come from a networking background. I think it's an interesting thing to sit where I'm sitting now, because in network engineering and when you're doing this kind of evaluation that's very physical, you solve problems in one way, right? So I, everything sits atop that, as you said, like protocols and stuff like that sit atop that. But like, is something getting from point A to point B as fast as possible? Well, that could be a routing issue. That could be the number of devices in between, all these kinds of things, right? And then you get into this universe where you're talking what would be in an OSI model called the application layer, right? So everything on the web is sitting at layer 7, and or you stop kind of thinking about that. And the fact that when you talk about routing now in my work, it's related to code, right? Like routes in code, which are very different from where I come from. It took me a little while to realize that most of the people I interface with, after I kind of evolved from there, uh, from those roles, don't really think in that level. Don't even consider it. It should just work. I do think, to some extent, to greater or lesser extents, for the most part, that is where we've gotten to, where you don't have to think about it. Those lower layers are just, they're going to work. And when they don't work, the entire internet shuts down, right? Like when you have a DDoS attack on Cloudflare, like, oh no. And there's literally nothing that anyone, like no SaaS platform can do anything at that point, right? So I think it's an interesting thing to be reminded of now and again that, yeah, this is the linchpin, or one of the linchpins of this entire thing that we use daily.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's a good point. Like the infrastructure has gotten to a point where we just don't really think about it. And now with the move to cloud, it seems like, everyone is just hosted on each other's servers fundamentally, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
that's a SaaS platform only has to partner with a large cloud provider and then, they have all the infrastructure they need. And, it's interesting. I mean, one of the things that really I kind of look to you for like a lot of like technology theory because you like have this like foundational understanding and you're fairly technical. And, I like one of the articles that I wrote that you kind of inspired was complexity needs to live somewhere. Like this idea that technology is always going to be responsible for hosting that complexity and that just that complexity shifts around, but can never really fully be removed. And now, like, the like, cloud um, certainly helped with managing that foundational complexity. But then there's like AI, which is like a level above cloud. And so, like, how are you thinking about AI and where this complexity is ultimately going?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. First of all, not my idea. Definitely stole it from somebody. I forget what article. I wish I could attribute it properly. I'm sure it's multiple sources. Our CTO talks about it a lot at where I work now, and I think it's a foundational truth of technology, right? Uh, when you talk about cloud infrastructure, well, there's still physical devices somewhere, right? So somewhere there are these massive server farms that host these virtual devices, and the virtual devices host like virtual network devices and virtual computers. It is the beginning of simulation theory. When you push that out to where we are now in technology, or at least from where I'm thinking, I think that I am probably on the simplistic side. There's certainly a lot of people that understand the depth and complexity more than I do, but I think the where I'm sitting currently is the complexity is obfuscated somewhat because of the speed to market. So because there's so much of a push for this stuff to grow, everything seems new and interesting. And some of the underlying complexity of, like, so you hear these things about these new models that come out. Well, what are these models doing? These models are enhanced and becoming faster and more computationally impressive. And all of that is great, but it all ends up being like just kind of a black box, right? So when you ask me where the complexity lives, I think it's going over this barrier of this, like, oh, it's going over there now. That something is happening in this black box, and then something else comes out. And I think that is somewhat the history of technology. I mean, cloud architecture is the same thing. You don't, if when you build an AWS cluster that does auto scaling, historically, well, how would you do that? You'd have to like go buy new devices and put them on in the network and so on. So I think there is a level of complexity that is readily understandable because it is just something I knew was over here and now it's over there. But then when you layer on the fact that I don't really have a strong, deep understanding of how AI models work, right? Like that is not my strength in math. So there's that's going to live there. So there's that piece of it. And then the other part that I think is challenging from a complexity standpoint is that this is not a monolith, right? So the versions of this tooling that I see being most useful is when you're able to actually look at it as tooling, and it's not a single tool, it is multi-tools. Now you're starting the complexity of understanding which tool fits where, right? So when to use Perplexity, when to use Claude, when to use it, and what does a stack look like now where it's like, well, I'm trying to optimize to do this thing. And it goes even further, right? So as these models are blending and getting wider and doing more things, well, there's going to be more overlap of like, well, this one's good at this and this and this, and this one's getting better at that, and maybe it takes it a different way. So I think from like when I'm thinking of AI complexities, it's expanding so quickly. There's so much moving behind it, and trying to understand where and how best to leverage and use it. It is becoming the new complexity.
Yeah. No, it's a good point. I feel like with AI, before we always had a way to trace a bug, right? To trace some problem with the technology stack. Like you could always, it would, maybe it would take engineers a while to figure it out, but they would eventually figure it out, right? With AI models, like it's a black box. Like even the people that created these models don't really understand how they work, like as like fundamentally as you'd expect, because it's it's just so sophisticated now, right? And so that kind of like for an enterprise, it's a little concerning, right? To not to identify a problem and to not have a really good answer as to why that went wrong. How should an enterprise think about
Well, I mean, when you tell somebody that a system is non-deterministic, right? And as you said, enterprise does not work in a non-deterministic way. So I think until we rethink some things and decide what's acceptable, there's a fundamental incompatibility there that people kind of hand wave away. So then like if you were to ask me at a raw state, like how useful is AI for enterprise or for any business at scale? I think there's a lot of utility, but the smaller you slice it, the more consistency you'll likely get. But the problem you're talking about, traceability, is related and also kind of separate, because I think to some extent, the evolution towards SaaS and microservices and so on have changed that a little bit anyway. At a certain point, it's like, oh, it's that person. Like the traceability is like, oh, it's that SaaS platform over there's problem, right? That, like, that's why we're having this issue. Whether that is an e-com platform or whether that is AWS or whatever, Cloudflare, as I just said. I think there's a certain level of traceability that you need to get to, and then as long as there's uh, kind of SLAs and things like that in place, you hope to manage that past that, right? So this model does already sort of exist, but what I think challenging right now is there's not a formal use case, right? Like, people are using these AI tooling in all sorts of different ways. There's not a lot of governance and formality to it, and also there's not a lot of restriction to it, right? So I can set up a security policy to prevent people from doing certain things that might harm the firm in different ways, and try to manage it that way. And I can block access, of course, but now I'm taking away the tool entirely. But once I give you access to the tool, like, I don't have the ability to set security policies on that tool generally, right? So most all those tools, SaaS platforms, yeah, as best I know, none of the SaaS platforms have roles or permissions or these kinds of things. Like, don't ask these kinds of questions, or don't answer in this way. Only apply this model. Like, there's so much there that is not there yet. So I think from an enterprise standpoint, that's probably the direction I think is going to be the biggest challenge. Is to greater or lesser extents, enterprises want control, want predictability, want consistency. That's how you build the foundational parts of, like, planning and forecasting, these kinds of things that you kind of need to do. The tooling can help you do some of that, but again, if you try to deploy widely, you start to lose that control. So I think that's going to be the rub in the near term.
I completely agree. And it almost feels like AI just becomes another SaaS platform, right? Because it requires um, these governance tools, right? What I'm seeing at the enterprise with AI at this point is, you know, AI will get you 80% of the way there. And then, the last 20% is governance and ensuring that everything is consistent and like for like brand consistency, and compliant and things like that. And I don't know, it's like it does definitely rethink the way that we use like Chat GPT as a consumer, right? It's like it's just a text box. You're communicating with it that way, and then eventually it has to layer on some type of visual interface um, to ensure that it's usable at the enterprise. And so it's just like, I don't know. Are we reinventing SaaS? Is like I'm less bullish on like a uh, one AI platform is going to dominate the enterprise, because of this idea, because there has to be these controls in place that, at least in the near term, Fortune 500s really need the ability to have these workflows and governance tools. And so, it's, I don't know, I'm less like doom and gloom with like major consolidation with open AI just like taking over enterprise business. Curious what your thoughts are.
I'm not, like I said, my depth on a lot of AI means that I'm not going to make any prognostication about, like, long term or even medium term consolidation. I think in the short term, probably not.
Sure.
The
Yeah.
the reason why I don't, but I'll explain. The reason is that there are too many externalities as well, right? So it is also a matter of, like, take Microsoft. Microsoft still has great penetration in the enterprise globally, right? So what happens when you start better able, like, Copilot exists in GitHub, of course, and there's Copilot in Windows and this kind of thing. But when you can plug in better models and better tooling, how do we know how those things pair? How do those things merge over time? OpenAI, I think they've done a lot for the space, and I think it is a great tool set. But to the point you're making, I don't see enough to distinguish per se from where I'm sitting and how people are using these tools that I think I can clearly point to a quote unquote winner. I think the idea of AI as SaaS is probably how I think about it. I think you said it perfectly. It is just another tool. It is just another platform or set of platforms at this point. I do, just to say, I think how people use it as a consumer or as in my personal life, like, all the stupid things I use it for, as compared to like what it could be in this like much more architecturally wide enterprise environment, right? There's a lot of space there that something like a agent that is purpose built to do certain things, there's a lot of value there when you put in those guardrails of governance and measurement and traceability. I think there's space for something like that to arise. I just don't know if that's a near term thing, and I would bet not.
Yeah. Yeah. I completely agree. The way that technology has always kind of been thought about is it's people, process, and then the tech that supports it. And I think what's happening now is that is shifting significantly, especially with, companies like Walmart are saying that they're not hiring for the next 3 years and they're just going to double down on AI to continue to expand and not hire additional employees, which is like a bold statement for such a massive company, right? And what I think is happening is like instead of people process tech, it's becoming process technology and then people, right? We're kind of like flipping those paradigms, and that's crazy. Like, what are you seeing? Like, you do a lot of projects, you work with a lot of enterprises. Like, how are they thinking about it?
I think it varies a little bit. I think I work primarily in e-commerce, right? So there, at the end of the day, there's a human, like the person buying the product is usually human, right? As best I can tell. Having yet gotten to agents acquiring goods, but because of that, I think there's always this somewhat connection with people. But I do think there's a focus on cost control, right? So how can we do more with less? And do I need to ramp up my team, my econ team, or my tech team to be able to fulfill the goals of next year and the year after and the year after, right? So especially at the enterprise level, you do think in multi-year strategy and planning, and all of a sudden the plans you made 2 years ago for what next year looks like or might look like are just night and day different, probably. You see this with something like integration, right? So tooling that allows I don't know if I want to mention any names, but there's a lot of tooling out there that basically connects source to destination in varying levels of automation. Well, what do you do now if you bought into a tool that hasn't yet integrated into any of the major AI platforms versus something like an N8N, which very readily does that. And now you can do things like feed data into a model, have that model exist in AI tooling, and be able to get better recommendations. So based on someone's purchase history, what does that mean for companies that do recommendations? If I can just do that and build my own model and build my own profile with a broader, like my profile, especially at enterprise level, my ability to build a customer profile is not tied to my ecom platform, right? I have multiple touch points that you may never see in the ecom platform. If I can aggregate all that and populate that somewhere and use other tools that are more more modern tech stack forward, the sales pitch around I'm a personalization engine of an AI with AI tooling is a lot less compelling. So it's not just in the individual enterprise, it's on all the platforms and products that they attach to. All of these things, these relationships are going to change.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we're definitely going to see a lot of brands start building their own tooling for, specific, you know, point solutions, right? Uh, Personalization is an interesting one. It really, content generation, something like that. But, over it really falls on the platform to be able to add enough value to where it's like this is not sustainable for the enterprise. You don't want to continue to manage something like this. I will say that complexity is greatly reduced because it's a lighter solution because all that complexity lives like further down um
Exactly.
that foundation. So it's interesting. We personally haven't seen that yet, but it's early days. And I wouldn't be surprised.
We have done one integration that involves N8N for specifically kind of the purposes that I outlined. And it's super interesting because this is a very large brand and they're launching a small brand. And this is where they're experimenting with it, with the idea of maybe doing it for a larger brand. for their broader brand. So I think there's this kind of experimentation, right? Like we have a small startup kind of within our umbrella. You mentioned earlier the point about like that shift of process technology people. I do think there's a relationship there, but I also think that some of that people piece may get dispersed in some ways. So what we're just talking about, somebody's got to do it. So while there's certain things that are disappearing in that sense, there's space here for enacting some of this, because some of it, that 80-20 thing you mentioned earlier, is spot on. I think that 20% gap, that's the
Wasn't my
people, right?
thought. It's somebody else's. I stole that.
Neither of us have original ideas. So
That's right. That's right.
the 80-20 thing is, it's appropriate, right? So that 20% gap of like 80, you can get 80% of the way there with kind of the tooling and one person or n number of people. That 20% gap is where I think a lot of brands need the help. And that's where the space might be. It might be not be the same number of people as older style departments and teams and things like that. But I think there's space there for sure.
Yeah. Oh, I don't. Yeah, I don't really think we're ever going back to the employee counts that we had prior to AI. Like, I just don't think that's going to happen. You think about like, you know, and Mark Andreessen said that software is eating the world. And if you looked at the associate employee counts with all those like marketing technology companies, there are like, 10,000 of these companies. Like, there's just so many of them, right? And so consolidation is probably actually a good thing for the space for brands. And, with more consolidation comes less need for as many employees to do the work because you're centralizing, right? So it's like, and then you layer on AI and it's like, okay, like there's just a major shift happening in technology. And it's honestly, it's kind of scary, right? It's like, as someone that's been in technology for 15 years now, it's like, okay, what are the jobs that are uniquely human? I'm in partnerships. I think that's one of them, right? Like you kind of need someone to own this partner. And so like ownership, I think, is now the name of the game. Like, do you own a channel? Do you own marketing? Do you own a partnership, like sales, whatever it is? There ultimately needs to be someone accountable for these business units. So yeah, I don't know.
I think I largely agree. I think so. The doom and gloom kind of worry wart in me is like, oh no, the world is changing. And then the thing I try to keep firmly fixed in my mind is, if you look at technology, let's say from the 80s, and you can go further back in that, it still remains largely constant. You had uh, in enterprise, you had mainframes. You had mainframes with terminal views into it, right? And everything lived there. So if you're a utility company, every single person, every address is in that mainframe. And the mainframe is the size of a building, right? So a few years later, those mainframes shrink and they're the size of a room. A few years after that, you don't even need the mainframe. Right? But then you go all the way forward, and this idea of like that terminal view into a singular computer. If you think about what some of our virtualized environments are, what SaaS is, right? So if you're on SAP, the hosted version of HANA, you're basically still using a terminal server, right? So if you're using Shopify admin is basically that, right? It's prettier, it's much better. It's on a green screen, and there's a lot of evolution there. These things do become cyclical, and you do see, and just to say, in the marketplace we're talking about, you do see consolidation if you look over the number of years. If you go back to the 90s, you had several large consulting firms that dominated so much of the space. And then post Enron, you had Anderson breaking out. These things happen. There's fragmentation, there's consolidation. It is the ever shifting nature of working in technology space. It's just a matter of whether you can ride these waves and these different things that happen.
Well, it's actually just a good time to switch gears. I mean, you're involved in a lot of CX projects. And so I'm kind of curious, what leads to failed projects? Because it's something that I think happens too often. And I'm, as someone that's kind of, starting the planning process with, clients and getting them ultimately live and hopefully successful, like what are the common faults that you see throughout that process?
So I think projects can fail in different ways. just to say that out loud. I think that's probably not so shocking to people, but I think they're all versions of chaos. Is what I'll come to. So I think especially for projects where I work now, Van, we are sometimes the first partner that a client will, a new brand launching, but oftentimes we're not. Oftentimes we are stepping in as a firm has grown and been successful and come to a certain point, and there's this thing that happens of like, what's the next thing to improve to get to that next point? And I think that is a specific set of challenges. And I think the challenge for us oftentimes is they know they have to change, they know they have to launch a site. There's a lot of inputs that are needed, and that can come in different ways. The things that I think in that regard that are consistently bad, or the things that I often see that are consistently bad that manifest in slightly different ways, is dispersed, not leadership, accountability, I guess. Who owns the decision making? How well are, and it's sometimes one person, but oftentimes not. How well do they know the decisions they're making, the second and third impacts of the decisions they're making? Do they have, if there's shared ownership or shared accountability, how much unity is there in that decision making, right? So is one person agreeing just because they have to, or they feel like they have to, and something's going to fracture down the road, or they think they're aligned on one decision, but there's another decision coming that they're not aligned on that actually impacts the first decision. So there's a lot of that kind of thing, and this isn't me saying that, this isn't trying to take shots or anything like that. This is just, it's part of it, right? I think that especially for brands that have grown tremendously, which is again a lot of times is when clients will come to us. Uh, there's a thing that's happened. You've made these decisions. You've kind of all been moving in lockstep, and now you may not be. Kind of a secondary thing off of that is, how did you get to where you're at, and how willing are you to move away from that, right? So my favorite example, my pet example internally, is you can build a great brand, a single product. You can be making tens, hundreds of millions of dollars a year off of one product. That may not be what you want for your investors, right? So as your brand grows, you try to do things and you're like, oh, we need to broaden our catalog. Well, when you broaden your catalog, you're suddenly, all the things you did before to grow hundreds of millions of dollars with a single product, they may not work when you go to four, right? And you might actually hurt the sales of your one. How willing are you to absorb that pain? How willing are your investors to absorb that potential pain, with this idea of, all right, well, like, yeah, our 2-year plan, our 2-year path doesn't look so great, but our 5-year does because of this, and this. So there's these kinds of things that I think are probably the single biggest challenge for the projects that we work on. Uh, I think if you would ask me in terms of like what more directly impacts, so that's kind of like broad, big picture, entity level stuff. If you'd ask me what impacts more like the end product, so it's probably that first one. I think our team does dev and design. I think we can build a great website that helps you go from one product to 4 products if you're willing to absorb those pain points. But if there's fragmentation in terms of end goal, and when I'm saying fragmentation, I mean on the client side, if there's not this united thing that they can convey to us, is the other part of that, then it becomes really challenging. Like, we can design something beautiful that doesn't make our client happy. That's a rough experience for us, right? That is never our goal. It leads to a lot of conversations internally. So I think that's the biggest challenge. And from my team side and what we do, the hardest part is trying to make sure we're shepherding the client in some sort of structured process where we can pull that out and we can work through those challenges. That's, sometimes that doesn't work.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like SIs and agencies, they often get to see some of the politics play out in real time when they go on site, and there's clearly some disagreement on direction and strategy, and then sometimes it must be pretty awkward just being like, this is our recommendation, or this is the prompt, and just hearing it play out. It's ultimately positive for the brand, but awkward for you, right?
Yeah, not always the best room to be in.
Yeah.
And hey, anyone, pretty much every agency or service provider I've worked at, sometimes that means you're kicked out of the room.
Right.
It gets to a point where it's like, oh no, actually we need to terminate this because for whatever reason, like we're not where we thought we were. Actually, like this is completely off or whatever it is. There's a risk there. It's a little bit of a catch-22 for us as service providers.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the change management piece I'm making an assumption here, but it seems like that must be the hardest part of engagements versus just implementing the technology. Like that's something that you've seen many, many times, and technology is very straightforward, right? It's harder to architect it, but people are much more variable, right? So it's just that's really what you deal with in some enterprises.
Well, when you say change management, what do you mean? I'm kind of curious if you.
Like,
I largely agree with your point. I'm just
yeah,
curious if on.
you inherit what has been done and the way that things have been done when you engage in a project, right? And so undoing that with the people involved is probably the hardest. I would assume is like the hardest thing to ultimately change within an enterprise. Like swapping out technology, like you guys understand that really well, but you don't understand the internal politics that are behind these brands and organizations, right? So like that's the point that I was trying to make.
Yeah, no, I think I do agree. I think it changes a little bit depending on the entity and kind of the way that they've come to a conclusion together versus just having shared pain points. I think if you're just like, oh, this sucks and this is painful, or I can't do this as well. Exactly what you say, right? I feel pain, but now you're giving me a new pain and pushing me into a new system, and I think you get the resistance that you're highlighting. I do think some, you know, the multiplicity of clients attack things all different ways. Some clients are definitely able to be more structured. They've already had these decisions or discussions internally and accepted certain things, already done the convincing. That those are when you talk about the opposite of what I just talked about, that's that, right? It is this thing of, well, yeah, you guys have through maturity of process or maturity of staff or whatever it might be, there's a thing that can happen that is the best case. And then a lot of this stuff becomes a lot more straightforward. It's how do we help you succeed, which is a much more fun conversation.
Yeah, no, for sure. Great. Joe, I like always appreciate your perspective. Thanks so much for coming on and, watch out for this guy. Like he's out in the wild and he's taking over the world. So,
That's so. Yeah. Thanks, Kyle. Thank you for having me. It's great talking to you as always. Love talking technology with you. You said some very nice things about me, but I don't undersell the fact that you cover a lot of ground, my friend.
try to. Cool. All right.